Okay, right. Well, I'm going to give a brief overview of my experiences and thoughts acquired over the past 15 years or so that I've been involved in the general area of notching. And I'll give a few examples of work that's been done in England and Wales in particular, and raise some sort of questions which may help, first of all, to provide some context. Firstly, what do we mean by notching? Why would you want to do it? Where would you want to do it in the UK? And then has it worked when it's been tried here? And was it worth it? And finally, should it be done again? And if it should, where would the funding and the justification come from? So I have a different definition of notching, really, from our Dutch counterparts, I think. I see notches, in a broad sense, as a continuum. At one end of the spectrum, you have shallow scrapes, shallow depressions, bowls or basins. Then you have what I call notches sensu stricto, which are deeper, often elongated excavations, generally of limited depth, but which do not pass through the entire width of a dune. They kind of simulate a natural blowout. And certainly in the UK, we get natural blowouts or modified natural blowouts that extend down to the beach. So I don't agree that blowouts are necessarily detached from the beach. They can be, but not always. And finally, at the other end of the spectrum, I regard elongated excavations which pass through the entire width of a dune as cuts. These are artificial cuts, and they can vary in depth from being relatively shallow to the entire height of a dune ridge. Now, scrapes, notches, and cuts all involve the movement of increasing volumes of sand, but at increasing scale and increasing cost. And that's important when you're trying to decide what method of intervention you might consider on a given frontage. And very often, it's most efficient to locate artificial scrapes, notches, and cuts at the sites of existing small blowouts or within larger stabilized blowouts, so as to try and reactivate natural and existing features. They're often most effective too when combined with other kinds of intervention, like turf stripping, for example. So this is just a cartoon that shows the three definitions of the broad idea of a notch. On the left there, you've got scrape, notch, and cut of increasing depth and spatial extent. Now, cuts shown in profile view can either be flat, slope seawards, slope landwards, be concave, or irregular with hummocks. And there are different reasons why you might wish to create each of those profiles, which I could explain later, perhaps. The central diagram here just shows you in plan, the kind of orientations and the forms of notches or cuts that you could create in relation to wind regimes, prevailing winds, in relation to secondary winds where they're important, and resultant sand transporting winds. And the plan view shows you can have everything from simple rectangles through funnels through to sinuous forms. And each one of these has been tried in the UK just to see what difference the actual plan form makes, if any, to the final result. And of course, in cross-section, you can modify your artificial form, cut or notch, from being V-shaped, relatively narrow at the base, through trapezoidal, deep or shallow, convex, concavo-convex, concave U-shaped, and shallow irregular. And again, many of those have been tried out in some of the experimentations that have been done in the UK since about 2011. So why? Well, as has already been said, both scrapes and notches create localized areas of bare sand habitat in their own right. They can also induce turbulence, which can encourage the formation or enlargement of natural blowouts, or increase the mobility of an existing parabolic dune. And you can create them in frontal dunes or inland dunes. Scrapes also, of course, can be made in interdune areas to create pools and wet slacks. But the primary purpose of a cut is to facilitate wind and sand flow from the beach into a hind dune area, usually in order to rejuvenate senescent yellow dune and grey dune habitats, which are sort of blocked off from the sea by a frontal dune barrier. And the sand excavated from a cut can be deposited on its landward side to create a sand lobe, which can then either spread out as a sacrificial sand source and evolve into a transgressive sand sheet, which grows bigger and moves landwards as it's fed by further sand from the beach. Now, any of these interventions may help in restoring or maintaining favorable ecological condition, and that has been the main driver for these sorts of works in the UK hitherto. So why where? Well, as in much of Europe, there's been concern about the stabilization of dunes. It became a concern in the late 80s through the 90s and the early 2000s. And this figure just shows you the reduction in percentage of bare sand within a number of Welsh SAC dune systems between the 1940s and 50s and 2009. The blue bars show you that there was up to 60% bare sand in the earlier period, but by 2009, you were down to less than 10% in many of these systems, and that became a major concern. And it was widely recognized that there was a desirable minimum target for bare sand of about 10 to 15% that should be sought, if possible, by intervention. So that was the driver behind the experimentation for frontal dune notching, which began around about 2010, 2011. Now, in that period, and extending up to about 2015, i.e. my company, was asked to look at a total of 29 sites around the UK, as in terms of whether it would be suitable or not to use foredune or frontal dune notching to enhance sand supply. And they're listed here and shown in red or yellow. The yellow dots being the ones where works were actually carried out. These are shown more clearly here and listed with their conservation designations. You can see that most of them are SAC sites. All of them are triple SIs. So it's primarily a nature conservation driven sort of investigation process. The lower part of the table shows who supported the works primarily and the number of notches which have been created. Ken Fig was the first in South Wales, and to date there have been 10 notches created there of different sorts. There's also been about 10 created at Newborough on Anglesey in North Wales. Elsewhere, we're talking about very small numbers, from 1 to about 4 maximum. So it's not been a very extensive program hitherto. Now, the first example, Ken Fig, as I say, was the first one. It's located in eastern Swansea Bay, open to the west-southwest, and part of a much larger dune system, which was built between started forming in the Little Ice Age, effectively, and continued until the early part of the century. But today, there's very little sand supply to these dunes from the sea or from along shore. Ken Fig itself is a sediment-starved system and is largely stable. This photograph on the left here, taken in, it's a satellite image actually, taken from 2024, shows you that most of the dune area, west of the motorway in the northeast there, is vegetation covered. You can see the little sort of greyish stripes and so forth. They are the intervention areas which have been created since 2011. There are a number in total of 10, as I say, so-called notches in the frontal dune, but several areas of turf stripping behind that area. And the idea was to try and link the beach again with the inland areas to produce larger sand sheets. Unfortunately, as I say, this being a sediment-starved area, it wasn't really the best one to begin with. We have to say that. And there's been limited success, as I'll say later on in the talk. There were 3 main phases carried out between late 2011 and 2014 in this area, shown here. And then more recently, in 22-23, there was a further area of works to the south of this area. Again, we've utilized multiple epochs of LiDAR imagery to look at the effects of the notching over time. They're just 4 comparative DEMs. But I think these difference maps, topographic elevation difference maps, show more clearly. In this instance, the red areas indicate lowering of the surface, and green indicates an increase in level due to sand deposition. So the left-hand diagram shows you primarily the effect of the sand shift works itself, whereas the later diagrams show you the effect primarily of natural processes, sand being transported landward, primarily as the result of cannibalization, i.e. widening, deepening of the notches, rather than new sand from the beach in this instance. This is just a comparative image of the most recent work carried out in 22-23. Again, there were 2 notches created down here, which we've numbered 9 and 10, with areas of turf stripping behind. But as you can see, but it's really too recent to see any material effect for this scheme. Now, unfortunately, the works at Ken Fig were not helped by the fact the weather conditions were not suitable immediately after the works in 2012. We had a very wet period with low wind speeds, abundant fog in the summer and so forth. In July 2012, you can see there. And standing water occupied some of the scraped areas for long periods of time. Vegetation recolonization was very extensive within the first 12 to 18 months and required further action to kind of like counteract it, involving spraying and digging it up effectively. We looked at this in some detail just to see what had been going on, and it was an unusual period of time with very low wind speeds, particularly from the west and southwest, which are the prevailing directions, in the key period of 2012, the spring 2012, and in the spring later of 2013. The cumulative wind run over this period here, shown from 2000 to 2013, shows a dip, as you can see, actually after 2010, but particularly in 2013 there. It was really a period of low wind energy, and at the same time, a period of very high rainfall and high standing water levels. So that was just unfortunate. Second example I want to look at was Ainsdale in northwest England, just north of Liverpool. This is a kind of intermediate between estuarine and open coast scenario, but has fairly high wind exposure at it. The whole coast here is lined with dunes, and essentially they are, mostly at Ainsdale anyway, vegetated. In 2022, it was considered it would be quite an interesting experiment to see if we could increase the rate of sand supply into the Hind Dune area by creating a number of notches. 4 were actually sort of constructed in 2023, and you can see the effect of them there in the middle photographic image. Again, not insufficient time has really passed to allow judgment about these, but there has been some spread of sand from behind the initial placements in the inland area, as shown in the right-hand photograph there. So it's going in the right direction, but too early to see what the long-term success will be. Same sort of process of evaluation with sequential LiDAR has been followed. Just a few photographs of the works, and you can see that they're actually much smaller than the Dutch equivalents. In Britain, most of the notches have only been 10 to 25 meters in width, something of that order, but have tended to cut through the full width of the frontal dune. So they are cuts by my definition rather than notches. Again, here you can just see the elevation differences between before works and immediately after works on the left, and then since the works to 2024 on the right. So some spread of sand, but it isn't enormous over this time period. The third example I just want to illustrate is at Formby, also on the Sefton coast, where small-scale notching was undertaken in 2022 with the aim of burying an area of tobacco waste, highlighted in the right-hand image, there are photos there. This is an area that was a nicotine waste dump in the 1960s and 70s, and basically is colonized by nettles and thistles at the present time. So it was desired to bury it with sand and allow natural dune vegetation to develop on top. So hence the requirement really to intervene. The edge of the tobacco waste forms an indurated cliff which stops sand blowing onto the dune top naturally. So the thought was to sort of excavate trenches inside it to allow that flux to take place naturally, shown on the right hand illustration. These excavations were actually quite shallow, as you can see, because the idea was not to cut too far down into the waste deposits, because that would have caused problems of disposal. The waste material is very high in nutrients, and the whole idea was to keep it in place effectively and to bury it and allow natural vegetation and topography to develop on top. And that was the thinking here. Again, looking at the LiDAR sequences, you can see in the middle diagram the result of notching the actual excavations that took place, and then the most recent scenario where there's been a little bit of sand accretion at the back, but again, it's not so far not been very significant, small scale, and we'll just have to see how it develops. But it has begun to be successful in burying the area of nettles, particularly on its landward margin. The other thing these topographic difference maps show you is that the dune front has eroded significantly in this area. All the red is sort of upper beach and frontal dune erosion. And this is a problem that we face in the UK. A lot of our dune systems are eroding. Sand supply to the beach is very, very restricted. It's very different to the Dutch examples we saw earlier on, where there's significant longshore sediment supply, which is often trapped by big port breakwaters and things of that sort, feeding the notches. We do not have that in any of the British dune notch trial situations. Another problem that we faced in the UK with doing these experiments was the requirement under the planning process to basically carry out risk assessments, to identify triggers, and to have a program of mitigation measures in place if things got out of hand. So monitoring programs had to be set up, these triggers had to be identified, and a written sort of protocol put to the planning authority to actually get planning permission at all. And indeed, there are occasions where applications for notching have been turned down by planning authorities on various grounds, either because they were going to impact on archaeological heritage, or they might pose a threat to assets and infrastructure in the Hind Dune area. So this is not a situation, again, which seems to apply in the Netherlands, where you've got a much wider frontal dune system to play with. In Britain, very often, we have this heritage issue, and also we have a lot of assets very close to the dune front. So finally, has it worked and was it worth it? Well, you need really at least 10 years to make an adequate assessment, and you have to consider a number of different criteria. At the moment, we've only got 3 sites where works were conducted over 10 years ago: Kenfig, Merthyr Mawr, and Newborough, which consists of 2 parts. And my sort of qualitative judgment is that so far, the effect of the combined works, i.e. notching and stripping at these 3 sites, is that they've had moderate to low success, and it's declining. The areas are still more dynamic than they were pre-intervention, but there is significant revegetation taking place, and that's true at all of the sites. Should it be done again? Well, I would say only where the geomorphological and climatic conditions favor it, and in particular where you've got adequate sand supply to feed through from the beach into the dune systems. Also, you should only do it where there's no risk of increasing flood risk, or that mobile sand will pose a threat to assets behind. And one of the problems we have moving forward is that we won't get any more large EU grants, and the UK government has other priorities. So we have to look elsewhere. And one is the current interest in adaptive coastal management. And there is the possibility of using adaptive management funding for flood risk purposes to incorporate notching into those development plans. Smaller works can be funded from other budgets, probably without any problem. Finally, I'd say if you want any more information about what's been done under the British programmes, have a look at the Sand Dune Manager's Handbook produced by the Dynamic Dunescapes project, which was an EU-funded project, or many of the kind of assessment reports for individual sites that I referred to can be found on our company website under the publications heading. That's all. Thank you very much.